Have you ever wondered what it means to be in the presence of God? What happens when the Almighty chooses to dwell among men? In the desert, amidst the scorching heat and the absolute silence, stood the tabernacle, a sanctuary that was not just a physical space, but the place where heaven touched the earth. The tabernacle shone like a jewel in the middle of the camp of Israel. Its embroidered curtains, the golden utensils, and the constant aroma of incense filled the atmosphere with an almost palpable reverence. Everything there had a purpose, from the altar where sacrifices were made to the lampstand that illuminated the interior with a soft light, symbolizing wisdom and the presence of God. As the psalmist wrote, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." Psalm 119:105. So is the tabernacle, a beacon for the people of God, reminding them that the Lord walked with them, even in the desert. Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, had a unique privilege. They were chosen priests, entrusted with maintaining the order and sanctity of that place. They had witnessed God's glory up close, an experience that should have filled their hearts with awe. But familiarity often blinds. Perhaps for them, the daily rituals had lost the weight of their sanctity. Or maybe something deeper, a silent pride, had begun to grow. The sound of burning incense still echoed through the air, and the sacred flame on the altar burned without ceasing. Yet that day, something disturbing was about to happen, something that would reveal the terrifying holiness of God. What does it mean to carry a spiritual legacy? For Nadab and Abihu, the answer seemed clear from the start. As sons of the high priest Aaron, they grew up surrounded by stories about God's power and faithfulness. They heard accounts of how the Lord delivered Israel with his mighty hand and chose their family to minister before the tabernacle. This position, however, was not an empty privilege. It was a calling that demanded total obedience. As priests, Nadab and Abihu had access to the Holy of Holies, a space that symbolized God's very presence. Every ritual, every gesture, and every detail of their tasks was laden with spiritual significance. But over time, routine can transform even the most sacred into something mechanical. Perhaps for Nadab and Abihu, the frequency with which they performed their priestly functions led them to underestimate the holiness of God. Or perhaps their prominent position as Aaron's sons subtly fed their pride. "Be holy, because I, the Lord, am holy." Leviticus 11:44. These words were the core of what God expected from his priests, but they began to lose weight for the two brothers. On that fateful day, Nadab and Abihu took their censers. Perhaps they wanted to complete the task quickly, or thought God wouldn't notice a small deviation. But the fire they decided to use did not come from the sacred altar, as God had commanded. It was a common fire, devoid of the necessary holiness. They moved toward the altar with external confidence but spiritual blindness. What should have been an act of worship turned into a moment of disobedience. As they took the next step, they were about to cross an irreversible line. Have you ever wondered what happens when we treat the sacred as something common? Nadab and Abihu were about to tragically discover that the holiness of God cannot be profaned without consequences. They walked toward the altar with their censers, believing the incense would be enough to please God. The flame they carried was not the one ordained by God, but seemed sufficient in their eyes. Perhaps they thought, "Oh, what's the difference? After all, we're doing what we were asked to do." Inside the tabernacle, the atmosphere was filled with reverence. The golden lamps cast reflections on the richly embroidered curtains, and the aroma of incense filled the air. But at that moment, the presence of Nadab and Abihu seemed out of sync with the sacred environment. When they reached the altar, they raised their censers. The fire they used symbolized more than disobedience. It represented an attempt to offer something outside of God's standards. It was as if they were saying, "We can decide what is acceptable before the Lord." Time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, something terrible happened. A living flame, unlike any other, came out from the presence of God. It was not a fire that brought warmth or comfort, but one that consumed, charged with divine justice. Nadab and Abihu were engulfed by the flame in an instant. Their bodies fell to the ground, lifeless, while their priestly garments remained intact. It was a clear sign that God wanted everyone to see the judgment without ambiguity. Outside, the people of Israel saw the smoke rising from the tabernacle. Murmurs and cries of fear filled the camp. Everyone understood that something terrible and holy had happened. Inside the tabernacle, only silence reigned. Aaron was present when it all happened. The silence that followed was almost palpable, heavier than any cry of lament could be. He looked at the bodies of his sons and knew without a doubt that God had acted justly. But that didn't lessen his pain. Moses approached and said firmly, but with a touch of compassion, "This is what the Lord declared. Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored." Leviticus 10:3. Aaron remained silent. He knew he couldn't question God's judgment, but within him, the struggle was intense. As a father, he felt the crushing weight of loss. As the high priest, he knew he had the responsibility to show the people the reverence God demanded. The bodies of Nadab and Abihu were removed from the tabernacle by their relatives, as commanded by Moses. The people watched in silence, filled with awe. What they had witnessed was not just punishment, but a living reminder of God's holiness. Aaron's silence was not resignation. It was a testimony of faith. He accepted that God's holiness was beyond human understanding and that the Lord always acts with justice. What was God saying to Israel through this tragedy? For the people, the death of Nadab and Abihu was more than personal punishment. It was a lesson that resonated as a collective call to obedience. Moses, with his firm and authoritative voice, gathered the leaders of Israel. His words broke the silence that hovered over the camp. What happened today must not be forgotten. God has called us to be a holy people, set apart from all other nations. He is just, and his commands are not suggestions. When he speaks, his words reflect his holiness and perfection. The people listened in absolute silence. Many had witnessed the smoke rising from the tabernacle and felt the weight of what it signified. Moses continued, "You have seen with your own eyes. The Lord does not accept disobedience, especially from those who approach his presence. This is not just a message for today, but a warning for future generations. Those who serve God must do so with reverence and obedience." The tabernacle, once a place of hope and adoration, now also symbolized divine justice. The sacred fire on the altar continued to burn, a visible and constant reminder of God's presence and expectations. The people of Israel left that place with a renewed sense of awe, aware of the seriousness of approaching God without reverence. And what about us today? The story of Nadab and Abihu is a timeless warning. We may not stand before a physical tabernacle, but God's holiness remains unchanged. How often do we treat the sacred with indifference? How often do we offer shallow worship or neglect his instructions? Our profane fire might take the form of insincere prayers, disobedient actions disguised as good intentions, or prioritizing worldly things over God. Like Nadab and Abihu, we risk believing that our intentions are enough when God requires broken and sincere hearts. As written, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Galatians 6:7. God calls us to a life of obedience where every act and thought is a genuine offering to him. What does this story teach us about our relationship with God? Nadab and Abihu didn't just disobey. They ignored the essence of who God is: holy, just, and perfect. Their tragedy is not just a story of the past, but a warning for everyone who approaches him. The tragedy highlights the seriousness of God's presence, but through Christ, we have access to transforming grace. This grace, however, does not exempt us from obedience. It calls us to offer a holy fire. As Jesus said, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Matthew 5:48. Perfection here does not mean a life without mistakes, but a heart entirely committed to seeking God with reverence and love. Today, God invites us to walk in reverence and obedience, reflecting His holiness in our lives. Examine your heart, seek His will, and allow the sacred fire of God to purify and transform every aspect of your being. Let our actions, words, and thoughts reflect the glory of God, becoming a light that shines in a world of darkness.